This day's turning out all right after all. Wait!
Want to see how that ends?
It was at this exact moment I knew I was in for something special with this show. If you have a good eye for strong storytelling, you can usually get a sense of when something will probably disappoint or not, and usually you can know real quick whether or not it'll be worth continuing. These days I find very few things that grab me quickly and refuse to let go, and if I'm honest, usually those things are made in the West. For a good minute now, I've mostly been disappointed with the lack of ambition from Western storytellers, not just in terms of the narratives themselves, but also just in terms of presentation. Ever since I got back into anime in 2013, I opened myself up to an entirely new world of tales and a whole new way of presenting them. And one thing I kept asking myself was, why don't we make things like this here? I mean, the UK's media in general is quite dry, but even in America where there is a lot of ambition, how is it that there's not any real animated shows that adults can watch with an actual plot with meaningful character development? I learned over time that animation in the West is mostly regarded as a thing either for adult comedies or simply for children. Even though there were anime that have been respected and regarded as inspirations for a number of iconic creations in Western media, still it's almost as if this was just seen as some sort of Japanese thing rather than something that could be done in the West. And rather than make mature animated shows, instead a lot of show makers opted to just make lackluster live action adaptations of Japanese animes. Clearly, they understood there was something there, but for some reason they wouldn't just do exactly what the Japanese were clearly proving already works. Whilst there have been shows that have tried to achieve this before Arcane, they are few and far between, and regardless of whether or not you think they're good or not, I mean, Castlevania is definitely great, none of them have the harmonious and distinct blend of style and substance that Arcane accomplishes. And if you don't believe me, just look up shows similar to Arcane on Google and you'll find most of the lists are dominated with Japanese animes. To be honest, I don't know if I can say I expected anyone to take a shot at doing it anytime soon, and if I were to have guessed, I can't say Riot Games would have been high up on my list, but perhaps that's just because I've not paid much attention to their work outside of the original game of League of Legends, and even with that, I wasn't much of a fan. But after finishing Arcane yesterday, I can truly say that if this was Riot Games taking a shot, well, they hit a fucking bullseye. In the last month or so since Arcane dropped, I'd heard a good amount of chatter about it. Since I've not really looked at any reviews, I'm still not entirely sure what exactly people are saying other than it's good and they're surprised at how good it is. I personally only watched the show in the last few days because when I first saw it came out on Netflix, I wasn't interested since it said it was an animation based on League of Legends, which led me to believe it would be some shitty spin-off show that's primary purpose was to basically advertise the game and get more people to play it. Was that perhaps a bit of an unfair judgment to make, especially given I hadn't even seen any trailers or investigated the show in any shape or form? No, not really. I think it's a fair reaction to have given how the vast majority of projects based on video games have a tendency to be well, shit. And honestly, I probably would have forgone watching it for even longer if someone hadn't pinged me on Discord begging for me to watch it, swearing up and down that it was actually good. Then, as if conspiring with said person, the YouTube algorithm started to make some very sus recommendations. So I said, fuck it, I'll give it a try. I mean, I had the same apprehension about Squid Game a couple months prior, and that turned out to be fucking brilliant, so why not? I just hoped the story would be as good as was promised. As a self-proclaimed storyteller, there's nothing I love more than seeing a good yarn being spun. It's not easy to tell a story, and it's a lot harder to tell one that's actually any good. For me though, it's certainly one of the most important aspects to any piece of media, and I reckon that's true for most people. League of Legends is not a game known for its stories, so that was another one of the reasons I was apprehensive about Arcane. I mean, if it's coming from people who not only make games, but also games that aren't story driven, what's the chances their show's story would be good when studios that are known for crafting stories in their games have struggled to make the crossover to other mediums with their properties? But somehow they did it anyway. I understand that there's a lot of lore to League, and whilst I'm not familiar with the specifics of it, I can imagine the process required to translate it from the games to a show would require answering some critical questions such as, where do you begin in the timeline? Which champions do you pick to feature and not? Who are your central characters and what are the main themes and conflicts you want to focus on? In order for them to make a good story in the show, these are the sorts of questions they'd have to ask themselves. Of course, you have to give us a strong opening that grips the audience, and so we're immediately introduced to not only 3 of the main characters, but also the central conflict of the setting that ties all the characters in the show together. With all the lore they have, they could easily have opted for an expository dump style opening showing us some great conflict that took place eons ago and tell us how that led to today, but they didn't, and this for me was a good indicator that they knew what they were doing. But yeah, okay, great opening is one thing, but a lot of stories have a strong start and then fall off soon after. So why didn't that happen? Well, because Riot's answers to those earlier questions I stated were the right answers. Drawing from such a rich and sprawling setting, the best course of action would be to start with some of the more relatable characters you have, allowing the audience to see down-to-earth situations that make this new and unfamiliar setting feel grounded and not too dissimilar to what many of us already know. For someone like me, and I'm sure many of you, we might not know the lore of League and we're not really trying to have it be spoon-fed to us either, so just throw us into the story at a place where we can find our bearings and build a story in a way that logically follows on from there. It sounds simple, but it's something a lot of stories struggle to achieve, and again, when it comes to video game shows and movies, this seems to be one of the things they often get wrong. And there's a reason I believe the story in Arcane works better than in video game adaptations that are translated for the screen, and it's one that may seem counterintuitive, and that's that it's not truly an adaptation. At least not in the way that you would often think. Earlier, I said Arcane not being based on a game known for story was something that made me uncertain it could tell a good story, but now I've come to the conclusion that perhaps that's exactly why it managed to tell such a good story. See, oftentimes, video game adaptations are trying to adapt an already established narrative for the screen, but the issue with this is that what usually made those narratives work is the fact we engaged with them in that medium. Even if you try to recreate it shot for shot, which almost no adaptation does, you'll never be able to capture it because a video game is interactive, whereas a movie or TV show isn't. If you're telling a story in a particular medium, you should ask yourself why you're doing that, and this is a question that seems to not be asked oftentimes when an adaptation is being considered. Why make an anime like Dragon Ball Z into a live action movie when it's clearly got a ridiculous and over the top approach to its action sequences that would be extremely difficult to capture in live action, especially for the time it was being done? But even more grounded properties like the recently adapted Cowboy Bebop seem to find themselves losing something core from their source material, making them feel weaker than the original, and that's exactly what the issue is. It's a matter of the original story versus the new one. Most adaptations suffer ironically because of the fact they're an adaptation. You'll never be able to escape the fact that the audience of the source material will be comparing the two, and whilst an adaptation requires changes, a lot of people will dislike the adaptation simply for the fact it has changes at all. Once people have connected with your characters and setting in a way where they hold a certain meaning to them, the audience wants to see that meaning respected in the adaptation. But this presents a difficult situations for the ones adapting it because they have to please the original audience whilst making it engaging and enticing enough to draw in new people. So you might think the obvious solution is simply to just make a completely brand new story that has nothing to do with the original. And well, yeah, I'd often say that it's better to make a new storyline with some Easter eggs and references to the original source material rather than try to do a retelling. The retelling method rarely works, and you'll find it often works best with material that wasn't originally well known, and it's because of the lack of expectations. Like I said before, a lot of what I've seen from people is that they didn't expect the story to be so good, and the reason is because Riot isn't known for making great stories. This would be like if Fortnite decided to make a TV show. You'd probably think it would be terrible, but if it turned out like Arcane, you'd be shocked. Now contrast this with a studio like say BioWare, the older BioWare, or Obsidian, who some of the best stories in gaming and arguably beyond have come from, and you can imagine the expectations would be very different. Of course, they made decisions in the story that in general would be good storytelling anyway, but my point is that if this exact story had been told in a game first, they might have found more complaints when trying to make it into a show, because people would want to see specific scenes or characters appear in the specific ways they were originally used to, the original ways that they've become attached to. In other words, it's like the inverse of what we usually see, where most adaptations usually have to reduce the amount of details from the source material. Arcane is adding more details for an audience that never really had them before. The show is developing this setting, not diminishing it. It certainly helps that Riot Games is in the unique position that they could actually make a show about their game themselves rather than allowing Hollywood or some studio somewhere that lacks understanding or respect for the source material to touch it, because that's usually also why we get terrible adaptations. So all in all, I think the story was amazingly well done, and that's undoubtedly in part due to all the other elements that make up this show, like its colourful cast.
Let's keep this our little secret. Milo's wrong, Powder. You're stronger than you think. And one day, this city's gonna respect us.
A sign of a great cast is when I struggle to point at any one particular character and question why they're there. Everyone in this story serves a purpose. Each and every one of them has a role to play, however major or minor, and the beauty of it is how their decisions cross over with one another, making each actions the characters make feel all the more meaningful. Every single character is shown to have layers, and regardless of whether you like, love or hate them, there's no denying their motives are at the very least relatable and their behaviour is consistent. One thing they did that I think was very clever was spending a significant portion of time showing us these characters in their childhood. For me, having no real expectations, it wasn't a major deal, but I could see how for fans of the characters, not seeing them in their iconic forms could easily have been something that would have been done wrong, or conversely, they could have begun with them being iconic out the gate, spamming the show with fan service, but them choosing not to do so was another smart choice. Sure, I'm not a fan of League and I know next to nothing about the characters, but even I know who Jinx is. Yet I obviously wasn't paying much attention because I didn't make the immediate connection that Powder would grow into being her until this moment.
I told you to stay away.
Please.
I told you to stay away!
No! Why did you leave me?
Because you're a Jinx! Do you hear me? Milo was right!
When this happened, I got goosebumps because I knew exactly what was coming. Perhaps that was a feeling fewer people would have because either you knew who she would become or you knew absolutely nothing. But I feel like for me, having that little bit of understanding went a long way to make moments like this far more powerful. And that couldn't have been achieved if they had decided to begin with the characters in those iconic roles from the outset. This is the difference between focusing on the story first and fan service second. They prioritized the narrative and character growth, ensuring that those fan service moments felt earned, that it was a natural progression of the events and choices that had come before. The fight between Echo and Jinx is cool as fuck for sure, but it's not just cool. It has weight to it because it's a battle between childhood friends. That's not something you get in the game, and so they provided a new experience for old fans as well as something equally as meaningful for newer people like me. That's why nothing feels forced, nothing is shoehorned in for the sake of sating the appetite of salivating fans. It's all centered around making the world and the people that live within it feel true to life. It's easy to believe that Vi, given her background, would be the hard ass that she is, and yet she still has care for the people around her, her friends, and of course her younger sister. Powder, or well, Jinx, is easily a standout in the show. Her desire as Powder to want to help others and the tragedy that is birthed from that causes her to take the steps down the path to becoming Jinx, and then the internal identity crisis and mental meltdown she has as a result. Sure, she's more capable now, but at what cost? And this seems to be a theme for many of the characters in the show, like Victor and Jace, both of whom want to bring advancements to their city and make life better for the people, but a constant question being asked both by and to them is, at what cost? What is the price of progress and is it worth it? And based on what I've seen about the lore regarding these two, I think there's some very interesting philosophical clashes regarding their answers to those questions to look forward to in the future seasons. Whilst I could go on about their characters, the main point I want to get across is that they're well made and to the standard you would expect of any good story. And again, I have to wonder, if these characters were more fleshed out in their source material, would these takes on them have been as well received? Regardless, just like with the story, they work because they fulfill the purpose that good characters are meant to fulfill. They're presented in a way we can easily relate to and understand, and the moments we share with them are heartfelt because of that. So yeah, both the characters and story are strong and well presented, but something that really helps to sell it all is of course the soundtrack and the animation style. I'm not an expert in either animation or music, but there's no way in hell I can talk about this show and not mention how spectacularly well done both of these aspects of the show are. The animation is just, it's fucking gorgeous. I wish I could do a breakdown and explain the intricacies of how it's made so I could better appreciate it, but make no mistake, I fucking appreciate it. From the very first moments of the opening to the very last moments of the closing scene, Arcane is beautifully crafted, and what's amazing to me is how consistently this level of quality is maintained from start to finish. The level of detail here is astonishing, and despite the fact that they used no motion capture, they managed to create realistic expressions regardless. It's not exaggerated, it's not crazy and cartoony. Each character seems to have their own little tics or gestures, and the way they're animated just feels completely organic. The fight scenes are stunning, and there's not much I could say that you've probably not heard 1,000 times about them by now, but it's truly impressive how well they've managed to make us feel the impact of each blow. This may be a fantastical world based on a video game, but it doesn't all feel like it. The fights have a sort of weight to them that you'd expect a fight to have, and whilst there's sci-fi powers and super cool strikes being made, none of it feels cartoony or ridiculous. This looks like how people in this world would probably fight. And the fights themselves always serve a purpose. They're not just there for the sake of having an action sequence to spice up a dull narrative or for the sake of flashy fan service. The fights have causes and consequences, as all real fights do, and because of how well the show is animated, these scenes feel more immersive and interesting. The style is engaging, and the soundtrack accompanying these moments captures the perfect mood for it all. There's a school of thought that music shouldn't stand out in a way that distracts from the story. I mean, sure, it shouldn't distract, but I think the only way that really happens is if the music doesn't remotely fit what's going on, or your narrative is so dull that the music basically overshadows it. In a show like Arcane, that's almost impossible. The visuals are so elegant and evocative that I would argue it's almost a character in itself, and the music backing it up does exactly what it's supposed to do by selling those visuals in a way that wouldn't be remotely as effective with a lesser soundtrack. Arcane shows us what is possible for Western animation, setting the bar on a new high, proving that we can have mature narratives and stories in this format. We can have all the style that Hollywood often opts to provide, whilst having the substance found in the very best of tales. Arcane doesn't compromise quality storytelling or style. It makes the best out of all the elements it's composed of to tell a story that I would argue could only be told in the way it was through animation. And that's what to me is perhaps the biggest takeaway from this all. Arcane is a show that used its medium to make its story all the more powerful. It's not a show that just happens to work as an animation, it works in the specific way it does because it's an animation. Again, the question of why you're telling a story in a particular medium is one that too often storytellers forgo asking themselves, but in doing so, you fail to maximize the power of the format you're using. Riot Games clearly understood this, and in choosing to go the animation route, a route they are already very familiar with, they utilized it in such a way that they could express the story and the characters in ways that specifically suit animation. This beautiful blend of both 2D and 3D is a testament to that, and the effort that they put into it really shows. Arcane is without a doubt strikingly shaped, with characters and a storyline that rival the very best of them. It proves that an animated show can be made with all the substance of any live action one whilst retaining all the style that animation affords, and it doesn't have to be anime or weeb to do it. It can be perfectly relatable to a Western audience with the narrative beats and character archetypes that one would expect, and it can do it at a level rarely seen in any genre. I had no interest in League before, and to be honest, I still don't, but like many others now, you can bet after my time with this show I've got my eyes set on whatever Riot Games has for us next. They've set a new standard, and I can only hope that it's one that other Western storytellers are willing to rise up and meet. This was a different type of video for me to make in some ways, and not so different in others. I really did only finish Arcane yesterday, and whilst there was actually another anime I was planning on talking about, I had to make a video on this show straight away because it just left that much of an impact. Now, I got a feeling this won't be the last time I speak about this show, but I want it to be known that in general, my content in 2022 and beyond will be far more diverse than what it's been so far. Now, whether or not that will actually be a good move for the channel is something I'm gonna have to find out, but this is the direction I'm taking. So expect a lot of videos on all sorts of things, and I'll almost always be covering it from the perspective of a storyteller. Anyway, I'll let the future content speak for itself when I make it, but for now, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, you already know how to show your support. If you have any thoughts of your own, please share them in the comments below. My name is NextGenNovelist, and that's all I've got to say, and I'm out. Peace.